The world 20 million years ago. Miocene Earth, cradle of the great apes. 1. Setting the scene. Time travel to the early Miocene. Imagine standing on a rocky outcrop in eastern Africa. The sun high and golden, in a warm but gentle sky. The year is not 2025, not 10,000 BC, not even 1 million years ago. We are going so far back in time that human existence is not even a concept. 20 million years ago, that's the early Miocene epoch, a period of profound change in Earth's history. This was a time when the hominid family, the great apes, including our own distant ancestors, was just beginning to take shape. The Miocene is often called the Age of Apes because it marked the first great radiation spread of primates that would later give rise to gorillas, chimpanzees, orangutans, and much later, humans. But before we talk about early apes, we need to understand their world, its climate, geography, vegetation, and other life forms. Only by painting this vivid picture can we truly imagine what survival meant for these ancient creatures. 2. Climate. A warm and welcoming Earth. A climate 20 million years ago was warmer than today, but not in the scorching, desert-like way we imagine for certain ancient times. It was a more equable warmth, with global average temperatures several degrees higher than modern Earth's, and with relatively mild temperature differences between the equator and the poles. Ice sheets were minimal. Antarctica had already started to freeze over a few million years earlier, but it still possessed temperate regions where plants could grow. Greenland was ice-free, and the Arctic hosted forests instead of tundra. Because of this warmth, tropical and subtropical forests stretched much farther north than they do now. Grasslands were beginning to expand in some areas, but they hadn't yet taken over the landscapes the way they would in later epochs. Rainfall patterns were different. Much of the tropics received steady moisture, allowing for lush forests teeming with life. 3. The continents in motion. By 20 million years ago, the continents were close to their modern positions, but not identical. Africa was still slowly colliding with Eurasia, closing the ancient Tethys Sea and beginning to form the Mediterranean basin. The collision between India and Asia had already created much of the Himalayas, but those mountains were still growing, and not yet at their modern height. South America and North America were still separated. The Panama Isthmus had not yet formed, so ocean currents moved freely between the Pacific and Atlantic. Australia had drifted farther north from Antarctica and was becoming drier. Europe looked different. Much of southern Europe was an archipelago of islands, rather than a continuous landmass. This shifting geography shaped the migration routes for early apes and other mammals. Land bridges occasionally formed during sea level drops, allowing animals to spread to new continents. 4. Vegetation. Forests. Forests everywhere. Well, almost the Miocene was a time of forest dominance. Though grasslands were slowly expanding, the vegetation types included dense tropical rainforests in equatorial Africa and Southeast Asia, the cradle for much of primate evolution. Seasonal dry forests in parts of Africa, with monsoon-like cycles of rain and drought. Temperate forests in much of Europe and North America, filled with broad-leaved and coniferous trees. Early savannas. Not yet the endless grasslands we see in Africa today, but patches of open woodland with tall grasses beginning to spread. 5. The animals of the early Miocene. This was a world rich in mammals, many of them strange to modern eyes. Primates. Early apes like Proconsul, Afropithecus, Moritopithecus, and Dendropithecus. Small monkey-like primates still lived alongside early apes, filling different niches in the forest canopy. Carnivores. Large saber-toothed predators, Machaerodus ancestors. Bear dogs. Amphicyonidae, a now extinct family blending traits of bears and canines. Early mustelids, weasel relatives, and vivarids. Mongoose. Civet relatives. Herbivores. Early relatives of elephants. Gomphotheres, some with 4 tusks. Small antelope-like ungulates. Rhinos, both horned and hornless species. Early giraffes with short necks. Birds and reptiles. Large flightless birds in some regions. Crocodiles and tropical waterways. 6. The cradle of the hominid line. Million years ago marks a critical phase in primate evolution. Hominids, the great apes, began to appear in Africa around this time. These creatures were not human, but they were our distant relatives, sharing traits that would eventually be passed down the evolutionary chain. Proconsul, one of the best-known early apes, is a perfect example. Size ranged from that of a small monkey to that of a chimpanzee. No tail, a key ape trait. Flexible shoulders for tree climbing. Walked on all fours, mainly in trees but also sometimes on the ground. 7. Life in the trees and on the ground for these early apes. The forest canopy was both home and refuge. The trees provided food, fruits, leaves, flowers, and insects. Height offered safety from many ground predators. Branch networks allowed for quick movement and escape. However, the ground had its own advantages. Access to fallen fruit and tubers, occasional foraging for insects and small animals, opportunities to travel between forest patches as climate shifted. The challenge was balancing the safety of the trees with the resources of the ground. A delicate survival dance. 8. Predator pressure and survival strategies. Predators were a constant danger, Large cats and saber-toothed relatives hunted in forests and open woodlands. Giant snakes and crocodiles waded near water sources. Raptors could target young primates to survive. Early apes relied on group living for warning calls and coordinated defense, agility in the trees to escape threats, keen senses, sharp vision, and hearing to detect danger early. 9. Long road ahead from the perspective of Earth's history. 20 million years ago was just the opening act of our family's story. Over the next millions of years, climate would cool, forests would retreat, and grasslands would spread. Some apes would adapt to more open environments, leading eventually to bipedalism, a complex chain of species, Australopithecus, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, and finally Homo sapiens would emerge. But here, in the Miocene, it was enough for our ancestors to survive each day to find food, avoid predators, and care for their young. The traits they carried, intelligence, flexibility, social bonds, would one day make us who we are. Asterisk 10. The Miocene climate in fine detail. To truly imagine the early Miocene climate, we have to picture Earth as a living, breathing organism, warm-blooded, pulsing with green life. The global average temperature was about a -6 degrees Celsius higher than today. This was partly because atmospheric CO levels were still elevated compared to modern times. Though much lower than during the age of dinosaurs, seasonal changes were less extreme. Winters in temperate regions were milder, summers not hot, and rainfall patterns more evenly spread through the year, though certain areas, such as East Africa, were beginning to experience dry seasons. Glaciers existed only in small patches on Antarctica's highest peaks. The absence of vast ice sheets meant sea levels were higher, flooding low-lying coastal plains and creating inland seas in some parts of the world. This warmth allowed tropical plants to thrive far beyond today's equator-bound limits. Imagine palm trees and broad-leafed evergreens growing in what is now southern Europe, and dense mixed forests carpeting much of what would later become the cold, open steppes of Central Asia. 11. Africa. The cradle and the crossroads. Africa, 20 million years ago, was the epicenter of early hominid evolution. Its equatorial regions were wrapped in dense rainforests, buzzing with insects, alive with the calls of primates, and patrolled by both tree-dwelling and ground-based predators. But Africa was not isolated. Around this time, tectonic forces were slowly closing the gap between Africa and Eurasia. The eventual land connection, the Gomphotherium land bridge, named after an elephant ancestor, would enable the first great migration of apes out of Africa into Eurasia. This connection would also allow new predators and herbivores to move into Africa, changing the ecological balance. This constant exchange of species is one reason evolution in this era was so rapid and dynamic. 12. Europe and Asia. Expanding ape territories. When early hominids began to cross into Eurasia, they encountered a land of mixed forests and seasonal climates. Europe at the time was partly submerged. Much of southern Europe existed as islands scattered across warm, shallow seas. These islands acted as stepping stones for animal migrations. Asia was massive, already home to diverse environments. Central Asia, open woodland and emerging grassland. Southeast Asia, rainforests similar to Africa's East Asia, temperate, mixed forests with cooler winters than in the tropics. This variety of habitats meant apes in Eurasia diversified rapidly, evolving new adaptations for climate and diet. 13. North and South America, separate worlds. The Isthmus of Panama was not yet formed, so the Americas were separate ecological worlds. North America hosted familiar-looking mammals, early horses, camels, and rhinoceroses, but also strange creatures, like oreodonts, pig-like herbivores, and massive bear dogs. South America was still island-like in its isolation, dominated by marsupials, giant flightless birds, and unique ungulates like the leptoptins. The primates there were New World monkeys, which had been separated from their Old World relatives for tens of millions of years.